everyone joining us at the Virtual Ethereal Summit. This panel is on the societal impacts of exponential technology, and we have a great group of speakers here today who I'll allow them to introduce themselves. We have a mixed background of people coming from large Web 2 backgrounds, from crypto finance, from the more disruptive side of decentralized technology. And we're all here today to go through, the way we'll run this is we will have the panelists introduce themselves briefly. We'll run through a series of questions, and then we'll get to the fun part, which is hopefully making this as interactive as possible and getting some audience Q&A. So Simon, maybe you could just kick us off and give us 30, 60 seconds on your background, why you're here today, where you are physically, and why the topic's of interest to you.
Sure, awesome. So hi, everyone. My name's Simon Morris. I am a native of Berkeley, California these days, and that's where I'm calling from today. I have been working with ConsenSys for a few months now. My background in technology goes back a little over 20 years. I'm a British expat. I moved to the US to go to business school and never escaped the gravitational pull of Silicon Valley. I've worked in mobility and security software. I spent a very long time working for a company called BitTorrent, and so was very close to the very aligned but different BitTorrent ecosystem. After that, I spent some time, I was involved in selling that company to Tron, which was an interesting experience. I then spent some time with the Libra Association as the head of product from previous to the launch to just after the launch, and been working with ConsenSys. And I just am completely infatuated with the disruptive potential of what we're trying to do here.
Right. And Justin, you're joining us from a road trip at the moment. Maybe you want to tell us a bit about yourself and where you are at the moment, because I have no idea.
Yeah, this was so I live in San Francisco, but I had something unfortunately unpleasant with family come up that I need to try to go and help with. So I am currently in rural Idaho, and hopefully the connection stays good. If it doesn't, I apologize. We'll try not to make it disruptive. Quick background, been building consumer software for 20 years or so, started with MLB Advanced Media, the online arm of Major League Baseball. Little known sort of reference, Bram Cohen, just with regards to BitTorrent, a guy named Justin Chapweski and I figured out how to do HTTP-based live streaming of video, which was a very early decentralized use case, just taking advantage of existing HTTP infrastructure to scale MLB TV to a much wider audience. And that was probably 15 years ago. I've had a variety of entrepreneurial experience since then. Started and built a company called Hot Potato, focused on connecting the audiences of large live events. We sold that to Facebook in 2010. Was the product lead and built Facebook groups and the sort of modern instantiation of Facebook's video products, and a few other things there. I'm really interested in the sort of evolution of technology and society as it relates to how we communicate and relate to one another. Certainly subjective with regards to Facebook, unabashedly, but I really believe in their mission. And also have spent time more recently engaged in the professional sailing world, where I'm building a bunch of technology there.
And Ron, you've had a not dissimilar background to Justin's, but ended up at a different big Web 2 company.
Yeah, so maybe I'll start with just the disclaimer that while I work at Google, I'm not speaking for Google at all in this. I'm speaking personally for my own opinion. So any credit or blame belongs to me alone. But with that, yeah, I've been, most of my career, I've been an entrepreneur. I've always been a techno-optimist and continue to believe there's great things out of technology. You know, I left the PhD program at MIT to start an internet company, Seabridge, that we took public with my co-founders. I moved on to work at an ad tech and big data and machine learning startup, QuantCast, around measuring the internet and addressable advertising. Started a big data and machine learning company, Think Big Analytics. We were acquired by Teradata, and now I am in the office of the CTO for Google Cloud, focusing on applying artificial intelligence. So definitely, you know, I'm in California, have been in for 20 years, Northern California. So certainly excited to talk about the topic today.
And Mona, you came up on the other side of the fence, the other big application of this technology on the finance side.
Yeah, so I'm joining you guys from Switzerland.
As we can tell from your background.
Yeah, yeah, I'm in the middle of the Swiss Alps, although it doesn't show from my background. But yeah, I guess so my background is in finance, and I spent most of my career in finance. I started off as a market maker and trader at Goldman in 2003. I spent 8 years there and then sort of moved to the hedge fund world and spent a lot of time in long-short equity. In 2014, I tried to launch my own hedge fund, which turned out to be a mini disaster. And largely because I didn't expect the operational and administrative side of running a fund to be so complex and complicated. But the one good thing that did come out of that experience was that I, for the first time in my career, started to understand how inefficient, well, first of all, how the financial engine works. And then secondly, how inefficient and embarrassing it was in this age of technology. So anyway, that ended with me sort of trying to take a year out, closed the fund down and never wanted to see finance again. And then 2 months later, discovered kind of Bitcoin and then Ethereum. And then basically that became the beginnings of Melon, which is known for having built the first on-chain asset management protocol. It's fully decentralized on Ethereum since a year ago. And we also became the first company, I think, in history to hand over control of a protocol to a fully decentralized DAO. We did that last year. So, yeah.
That's great. And that'll be a really interesting perspective relative to the technology background of some of our other panelists. Justin, I wanted to start with you because I know, unlike some of the media coverage, I think you have a very positive perspective on the impact that Web 2 and these applications that connect us all really have had on people. And maybe you could just explain where your perspective comes from and what you see as the great societal benefits that have emerged from this.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's pretty fascinating because it's all playing out live right now, and I would say that I imagine many of you all can reflect on a similar experience just over the past few months using the internet on a first-party basis and some of the services that exist like Facebook and others to connect more deeply with people that you love and that you care about, which, you know, I think the original goal for the technology was to make the world more open and connected. And frankly, I think, you know, it's fair to say that perhaps, not even perhaps, I know Mark and the team at Facebook have learned a ton since then, even though I haven't been there a little while working on it, but there's just been an incredible amount of effort on taking responsibility for the scale and the implications of the use of the technology at the scale that exists now. But just fundamentally, the idea, either in a centralized or decentralized capacity, that we have the chance to communicate effectively for free with anybody in the world. We have a more fundamental understanding of identity and therefore reputation and the underpinnings of trust, with and then the potential to be able to transact. That's what this was all about, and frankly continues to be. And I think this, you know, it's still playing out live. On a personal level, the past couple of years from a, you know, sort of quote unquote media perspective have been difficult because I'm really proud of what we built. But at the same time, I think it's just been at some level endearing as well to witness people just realizing that technology is a tool and it can be used in the context of its original intention, and it can also be used and abused. And it's just really, for me at least personally, really nice to witness a bunch of very positive use cases.
I think those are all, valid points, right? And clearly there's a lot of value in Web 2 and some of those technologies, but I think we have to acknowledge that technology has grown up and now has such a big impact on our lives that there's a tremendous responsibility, and that we're seeing, I would say, the way that technology is now mediating the information that people consume, right, and is affecting our democracies is a deep issue, and there have been some real problems in that space. And in the same way, I think there's a lot of challenges around what is the incentive structure, right? That we've got private companies, a tremendous amount of power that are, with an advertising-driven business model, have a lot of incentive to hack people's attention and to really drive addictive behavior, right? And I think there's been a recognition. I mean, what's happened broadly is there's been a bit of a whack-a-mole response to that, of when something bad happens as a consequence of that, people say, oh, wow, that's not what we intended. We better go fix that, right? So like, wow, it turns out that misinformation is better clickbait than reflective content. We don't want to have too much misinformation on our platform, right? But fundamentally, I think it's really hard to in a structure where a small number of organizations have so much editorial control, where basically so much content is controlled by their algorithms, there's no right answer, right? I mean, to be fair, any organization in that position that's mediating a lot of the content consumption of the world, they can't pick the right answer, right? Like to pick what's good content, what's authoritative content. Fundamentally, having and of course, none of the large tech companies have ever really wanted to be in a position of being the editors, but the algorithms are editors. Is the problem we're in, and it's mediating the way our society is working, right? So not only misinformation, but also things like digital addiction and gamification, right? Like things like streaks are driving, harmful behavior, right? Suicide rates are up for teens, and no amount of connecting through COVID is an excuse for that problem either, right? So, I mean, I'm not saying there's not value, but I think we got to be reflective about the responsibility and some of the harm that's being done, and therefore think more about responsible AI principles, where we really think about the impact on all stakeholders, and not just say, hey, this is great, we've learned the lesson. The apology tour continues. We're going to go out and say we're sorry for the bad things we didn't pass, but now we get it, and it's all good from here on out.
I don't think that's the current state of affairs. Do you feel that is?
I do.
Yeah, I'd sort of tend to agree with you, Ron. I mean, I don't, going back to the question, the question was, has there been a great societal benefit from Web 2? And I think it's hard to say a clear yes or no. Are we healthier because of Web 2? I don't think so. If any, I think it's hard to sit and have a conversation with someone and look at them in the eye, because everyone's constantly on their phones and distracted these days. Is our privacy respected more? No. Are we happier? Not sure. Are people feeling more grateful about life? Are they richer? Some people are. But there's a lot of people who, whose livelihoods went to zero as a result of Web 2 as well. So I think it's hard to say. I don't think there's a clear societal benefit, going back to the question. There are some pros and there are some cons, and I think we should just be wary of what those are and honest about those things.
Please feel free to jump in, Simon.
Yeah, so look, I look at this whole kind of debate through a frame of centralization and decentralization, and having been sort of to the heart of the kind of BitTorrent decentralization revolution and witnessed the impact that had on the media industry, I find decentralization, like real decentralization, real technical and organizational decentralization, to be this incredibly disruptive force that is challenging, because it enables people to break the rules and not have to be held accountable for having broken the rules. The experience of the whole BitTorrent episode really led me to understand that re-centralization is inevitable. And I really believe that. I think, and it comes down to a very basic truth, which is we like rules. We need rules. So it's not like I don't believe in a fundamentally decentralized anarchistic world, but I do see decentralization as this incredibly productive force to challenge the rules and challenge what had been centralized before. I worry greatly that Web 2, which was enormously powerful in terms of making information free and making information interactive, and totally free. I think some of the benefits that have been brought from that are really hard to argue with, but there have been downsides. But one of the biggest challenges I've seen with this is this giant re-centralization around, like specifically Facebook, Google, Alibaba, Tencent. It's really hard to kind of justify that type of re-centralization as a public good, because it gives rise to very profound accountability questions around decisions that are made, and are they actually truly accountable? Like, is it right that Mark Zuckerberg can make profound decisions that impact at least half the planet simply because he's Mark? And he has that power today. He very explicitly has that power today, and I think that's. And I'm not saying he's a bad person. I think he's a by all accounts a very honorable person. But that level of accountability, that level of centralization of control, I think is deeply concerning.
Justin, I don't know if you want to respond to that, or whether it would be more interesting to take us in the direction of, where.
I don't think it's frankly just I'm not here speaking on Facebook's behalf. Yeah. I can give you a character reference on Mark personally, but I'm not sure that's going to be helpful in this regard. I am interested in a discussion about decentralized technology, which I'm super open to, but I don't think it's fair to speak on their behalf in this context.
Absolutely, I was going to ask you precisely that. When you look at decentralization as a movement and how it happened, and some of the things that we see around us that are self-organized, and that ranges everything from a virtual conference like this to Burning Man to a DAO. And Mona, it would be really interesting to hear some of your stories about the governance issues that you've run into organizing a DAO. Justin, how do you see such principles being applied in this online world where so much is interconnected?
Sorry, could you repeat it? You just broke up there for a second.
I said, look, given the decentralization movement and what we see in these autonomous human elements and the enabling technologies like BitTorrent and Ethereum, how do you see this? What is your take on the transition to decentralized technology and how that could rewire some of these issues?
I think the thing that's interesting to me, just intellectually, is like where we can build, let's just say, like APIs, sort of programmatic interfaces into technology to allow for like societal norms to both establish and also interface better in these systems. A lot changed really quickly, and it takes time to adapt to that. And we're going to be adapting for a while, and things are going to continue to change. I think the internet itself is fundamentally a decentralized system, and its impact on what I'd call the kind of like the media experiment, which has been around for longer than the internet has, is pretty fascinating. But I think this whole discussion about who can say what, in what context, who's responsible for that speech, is a discussion that's like, we have a specific set of views about it in the United States. Other people in other parts of the world have a different set of views about it. And that, like, in some sense is not necessarily in conflict with, but creates an interesting challenge when it comes to the imagination of a decentralized system that can allow people all over the world to interact cleanly. And I think that's where all of this is just nuanced and frankly just really fascinating. I think, I like to think of these things sort of in two categories. I think of media and like the utilitarian functions around identity as two separate things. They can be coupled together. They can also be different. I think the, tools for allowing, like, to me, the like identity, reputation, trust, that infrastructure just like needs to exist. It can exist in a decentralized manner, it can exist in a centralized manner, but those are the like underpinnings for building anything that we're talking about in any of these systems. Even, and I think as you look at like the utilitarian functions that will ultimately allow for the sort of crypto finance ecosystem to succeed or fail, like they're built on top of those principles as well. And so it feels like super early days. It's kind of like when we were like speculating that people were going to like do stuff on their phones and we were playing around with WAP in like, the late 90s, early 2000s, and look where we are with mobile today. But we're probably still, I don't know, 10, 15 years away from this just being like commoditized and wide adoption of that kind of infrastructure at a different scale. It's certainly true that Facebook maybe moved us further through the ability to move more quickly in a centralized manner in some sense, but I don't think that's like necessarily part of the core values in some sense that I understood in that context. I think there's like more openness. I'm super curious about the gentleman that worked on Libra and his perspective on this too. I think that's more representative of like the evolution of their thinking there.
Yeah, so with regard to Libra, I mean, I think Libra is just a super interesting project, and I know all of the people in the team quite well, and I Justin, I totally attest to their characters and their intent and their their desire to try and make the world a better place. It's definitely kind of well intended as a project. I think the idea of having kind of blockchain-based systems as a way to try and decentralize governance, as making governance more accountable, I think is one of the biggest. I know some people work a great deal on this, but I think not enough. Like governance and decision-making and accountability, like using blockchain-based systems as a path to having something that we can all agree on as more accountable, something we can all agree on as something that we can trust, is powerful. I think Facebook, in regard to Libra, Facebook just by its sheer kind of enormous gravitational force makes it very hard to have something like the Libra Association take on a more obvious kind of governance and decision-making role. And I think, the sort of concept of, shelling points, the idea of kind of, well, what, in the absence of any more information, what's the answer to some specific question? And if the question is, who's in charge of Libra, I think it's very hard for most people in the world to answer that question and say anything other than, well, obviously Facebook is in charge of Libra. And I know everybody at Facebook would fiercely deny that, and that they're putting efforts to try and make that not the case. But I think there is a challenge about these decentralized systems, about very large organizations engaging in them, because they kind of have this sort of gravitational kind of force that makes their goals that much harder to achieve. And, and I say that, like, I think even a company like ConsenSys is obviously kind of a tiny company compared with something like Facebook, but with regard to the Ethereum ecosystem, I think ConsenSys has very hard questions that it needs to be very careful about its influence on the Ethereum ecosystem and not becoming too influential on the Ethereum ecosystem. So, I don't want to just be the person kind of throwing rocks here. I think there's real questions about how do you diligently use decentralized technologies to enable better governance and more robust governance.
I mean, Mona.
I agree with that, and I think there's a really important question about like what's the right role of government and regulation. I think it's got to be a light touch, but it's got to be done in a way that you get some certain guarantees and standards, right? Like I think the idea that you don't need regulation, that you'll have a self-organizing decentralized system is, at one time that might have been popular. That's pretty naive, and most people now recognize that. But it's like, how do you actually get the benefit of more decentralization, but still, have guarantees, right? Like it's important in functioning markets not to have things like insider trading, and it's important to have the ability to make certain claims, right? So if a given powerful company says like, look, it's a fair thing. We're all equal. That they don't have ways of tilting it or controlling it, right? And so I think that it's far from answered what's the optimal model. But I think there has to be policy interest in transparency and in guaranteeing what folks say. And I think there's also a real policy interest in some level of interoperability, right? I think a lot of the promise of decentralization is that you really have some great ability to try different things and still interoperate. And there's always commercial incentive to block interoperation, right? And that may even be, like in some antitrust rulings in past, like really being thoughtful about how bundling might be done, right? Like if a company sponsoring a given standard says, oh, well, we'll just provide the default wallet or something like that, right? That has some pretty significant implications. There's large scale distribution of that, right? So I think there's some real interesting questions, but I do think that the topic of governance and regulation have to fit closely together.
So, Mona, it might be interesting to hear your take just in terms of how you set up the governance for Melonport and what challenges you had doing that, the lessons from that and the experience and using that as a very different model than working at Goldman Sachs. And, follow up to that, to Ron's point about blockages. One of the challenges that we've had in the crypto ecosystem, of course, is getting access to fiat rails and the challenges around that. And maybe that would be an interesting second question for you to talk about a little bit as well, and whether you see this challenge of large incumbents trying to block innovation.
Yeah, so on the governance side, it was challenging because there's a lot more thought, I think, than many people realize that goes into good governance, and we kind of learned that the hard way because the way we approached it originally was, let's think about all the stakeholders in our ecosystems and let's make sure that whatever design we create, the stakeholders' interests are all going to be aligned in any scenario. And we thought we'd done a great job on that. And then we said, well, how can we test this? Because there's no other company on Ethereum until that point that had fully decentralized a protocol. And, how can we battle test this? So we looked up a traditional governance expert called Ilko Fiole, we found, and he came into our offices and he just kind of, was relatively new to blockchain. He had a good understanding, but, we basically just ran him through our ecosystem, who are the stakeholders, and he tore it apart. Like he literally butchered our first version. And well, what if this happens? And what if that happens? And what if this, and so we probably had to go through 3 or 4 of those painful sessions, and each one just got a little bit easier. He, found less and less holes in it. And then once we sort of had a final kind of draft, the approach we took was to find the best litigation lawyers in Switzerland and ask them to try and tear a hole in this and what can go wrong. And, how can you, what things from a legal aspect can you see going wrong with this? And so we went through the same exercise with them, and it was iterating and iterating and iterating. And, there's no perfect solution for governance, of decentralized governance, on chain. It's still a new thing. But our end conclusions in a nutshell were that, generally speaking, in our ecosystem, the people we felt were the most underrepresented were the users. So, token holders have their interests looked after. Developers and maintainers in the ecosystem have their interests looked after through the tokenomics. But one kind of user group that is often forgotten in kind of our world is the users themselves. And so we thought, how can we design a governance that basically prioritizes the users, because they're the underrepresented group? And that's basically how we designed our DAO. So the DAO is not, the DAO is a user representative and technically skilled group of people. And they're kind of, the group that they represent are the users of the protocol. So that means it's not just because you own a token that you're entitled to vote on certain things. It's because either you're provably technically skilled. So we have former auditors or formal verification experts or people who have substantial finance experience, or you've been a user on the network that was nominated by other users to represent you. And it's, it's been working now for just over a year. I would say, I think one big lesson has been that even DAOs need leadership. So, if there isn't an appointed leader at any one point, there's no one to drive things. So we realized that pretty fast, and we sort of have now imposed 6-month rotations for kind of a chair and vice chair on the DAO, whose job is really to make sure that there is an agenda, it's being driven, that people are turning up to the weekly calls, et cetera, et cetera. So, but it's, it's still far from, it's still experimental, it's still evolving. I think it's getting better with time, but it's been a really fun experience.
So Mona, I have a question for you, which is, how do you think about the ability to change the rules? Like, I understand how important leadership is, but if you can change any of the rules, then, like, presumably that means that the system is actually centralized and the rest of it's theater. And this is a question that we challenge ourselves with for years at BitTorrent.
So there's only limited things that the DAO can actually vote on. Probably should have said that. So the 3 things are network parameters. So that's kind of like gas, kind of asset management gas. You can think about it like asset management gas on our network. There's contract upgrades. So we don't force users into an upgrade, but we kind of propose an upgrade and then it's opt-in by the user. And the third thing is, I think I just forgot. Okay, so it's no, it's AMGU, it's network parameters, it's upgrades. Oh yeah, it's resource allocation. So it's so every year there's a fixed amount of tokens that can be minted, and those tokens can either be distributed or granted to participants in the ecosystem, or they can be burned. But we can never increase the inflation amount. It's like, the maximum cap exists. We can just decide to spend it or burn it. And obviously that decision is a little bit less technical and more economical. And the decision there arises from, well, if we spend this, are we likely to create more value versus the dilution effect or not? And I'm not sure we've, this is something we're discussing internally as well, whether we do have the full set of skills and the time required to make those kind of decisions. And we're rethinking. That's one of the things where we're looking to improve, actually, to improve on. So we're discussing internally about kind of different ways to enhance that process as well.
Mona, I'm curious though, some of the worst problems in past in blockchain systems have been, let's say, exploits that were allowed by the code, but that reasonable observers would say were unintended, right? That were essentially a hack that exploited if not a formal defect, at least a gap between the way the system was implemented and what reasonable people would have intended to happen, right? And it doesn't sound like those 3 areas are areas that you're allowing the DAO to respond, right? I don't know if that's come up or how you would think about that, but these are the kinds of things that have driven hard forks and acrimony and other ecosystems. And if it's not that, what is a fractious case where the DAO has had to contend with conflicting interests from token holders?
Yeah, so that's a really good point. So one of our so basically, I mean, our code is all open source, and it has been from day one. And everybody who uses our code is advised to review it, but also to if you're going to use it in a big capacity, to also independently audit it. But all of our audits have been, published, and they're sort of live. But that doesn't, like you said correctly, doesn't prevent unintended consequences that sometimes get missed. And our approach on that, although it's not, it's not live right now, is that we're working closely with insurance solutions like Nexus and Unslashed to make sure that as soon as it makes sense, and actually I think this is probably just a few weeks away, we will have insurance options on kind of assets under management within the ecosystem. Unfortunately, it hasn't been possible or it hasn't made economic sense for us to underwrite or support some of those solutions until now. But we're getting, the kind of ongoing discussions are such that we're getting to a stage where it should be possible soon. But this space is still so early that unfortunately these risks do exist. If anything, I think it creates a huge opportunity for insurers in this space because no traditional insurance company, as far as I've seen, will insure or touch a DeFi product, which creates opportunities for people that are willing to. And we're starting to see that coming in now. I think the economics around the models I've seen could be better. Like there's not a lot of upside to underwrite insurance risk right now. You don't get what I would see as an appealing yield to take that kind of risk. But those models are being worked through and improved, and I think that it's not too far away from being a reality that these models will make a lot more sense and therefore attract a lot more capital because the yields will be worth taking that risk.
Earlier, Ron made a generic comment that large incumbents, while they may speak to standards, commercially are disadvantaged by interoperability. Do you see that playing out between the crypto ecosystem and the fiat incumbents? And do you think that analogy from the technology world holds into some of the challenges that sometimes crypto companies have dealing with the fiat incumbents? I mean, we work at ConsenSys, we work equally with both, and we don't have a biased view on this. We think there are lots of positive applications of blockchain in traditional capital markets, and we work very closely with large banks and regulated financial institutions around the world. And many of the DeFi companies out there use our products like MetaMask and Ethereum, what have you. So, we believe that there are many positive benefits on both sides of the fence. But I'm just curious when you think about what Ron said, if you've seen any interactions like that in crypto.
I mean, if we have, they probably are not to our face. I would imagine there's a lot of that going on behind our backs. It's not hard to imagine that incumbents in the financial service industry are extremely threatened by some of the things that are happening in decentralized finance right now. And I don't say that lightly. I think for me, the most exciting thing about DeFi for me is not that we're reinventing finance. We're not reinventing finance. And anyone who says they are, you have to be a little bit careful about what they're actually doing, because finance, generally speaking, works. What doesn't work, the what works is the how that doesn't really work. So it's like, the thing about finance is that the protocols, and I don't mean protocols in this context in a technological sense, protocols have been existed for centuries. Protocols are just organizational procedures that enable participants to trust one another in a financial market. So when you're talking about payments, you're talking about, buyer versus merchant. In crypto, you don't have to worry that you don't need Swift in the middle to ensure that your payment will get there. If you think about exchanges like Kyber Network or 0x, they're just establishing trust between buyers and sellers, without the need for financial intermediaries. They didn't reinvent trading or exchanges. They just reinvented the how.
A few layers, yeah.
Lending, same thing. Borrowers and lending, and Melon is the same between, investors and asset and fund managers. And so the people who are really sweating it are the people, well, when they understand it, because a lot of them don't understand it, but are the financial service providers. If you think about it, the actual people, like the hedge funds and the kind of the people who consume the services, they actually love what we're doing. They're just too big and too slow and too bureaucratic to move fast enough. Financial services hate it and definitely put up a lot of blockers. And so, so yes, I believe there's a lot of that happening in the background. But in any case, our target market, I keep saying, isn't the incumbents.
Right.
We just genuinely, for us, onboarding BlackRock or Fidelity is just as big as onboarding my next door neighbor. Don't care. You know, one user is one user for us. We don't measure our success in terms of assets under management. It's just purely number of users. And that's what we're after. You know, for me, DeFi is about unlocking the long tail and, you know, creating a market for the, you know, 80% of the people who own maybe 20% of the wealth.
I mean,
but I think it's fair to say that there's regulatory risk, right? That those powerful incumbents with strong ability to lobby and influence regulators can create regulatory barriers. And I think, Jeremy, your point is right that at some point, if cryptocurrency is really a meaningful alternative to fiat currency, that would be viewed as incredibly threatening to national governments. Just think about how much the ability to control fiat currency and central banks' control has been critical in government response to a crisis like COVID, right? Now imagine a world where those levers are gone. There's now cryptocurrency is the standard, right? That would be very threatening, but I don't think that there's any response. My perception is there's no response on that axis yet because, you know, it's not perceived yet to be a real threat. And you know, typically governments react when a threat is abundantly clear and not conceptual and abstract.
Yeah, Ron, I agree with you. The one thing I would say is that I think it's totally possible to use DeFi in fully regulated ways as well as unregulated ways. Going back to the you know, we started off this panel speaking about that. But, you know, technology can always be used in good ways and bad ways. And I don't mean to say that regulated is good and unregulated is bad, but people can choose to use it however they want. And so I don't think even that would be a killer. I mean, making crypto illegal, that would be a big move. And I wouldn't put it past governments at all if it became a real threat, because that would basically take away the one, you know, especially, you know, maybe moving on to another topic, Jeremy, that you had, COVID. You know, especially in these kinds of environments where, you know, in general, you know, assets like dollar and traditional finance are in huge demand. Emerging market currencies, if you look at some of the emerging market countries right now, most of them are 50% or more in dollar, which is creating a real shortage in dollars, which, guess what, creates demand for crypto.
Yeah, I mean, look what happened in Argentina, right? One article I was reading, huge spike in acquisition of Bitcoin in Argentina over the last few weeks, and I'm sure
Colombia too. I think, yeah.
I think there's a great question that is in the Q&A, which is really about kind of it's not about kind of asking people what they want out of decentralization. It's asking people what they want decentralization to achieve. And if you look at history of music that I know kind of something about the kind of move from Napster and BitTorrent into Spotify ultimately, like people got something that's actually much better at the end of the day. People didn't care about the decentralization of something like Napster or BitTorrent. They cared about a better music product online. They cared about a business model that they could deal with where they could get access to great music online. And so the world resolves and moves forward. And I think, you know, the case about kind of, you know, Bitcoin in Argentina or Colombia, it's like people want to have a better currency. And so, and so it's not, I'm not convinced that people want decentralization for the sake of decentralization. Decentralization is a quality of a certain technology architecture that enables disruptive change to challenge things that are wrong with society. And then the question is, okay, well, what do we actually want instead? And you know, like Jeremy, I think you kind of challenged us ahead of time about, well, what are your greatest fears? What are your greatest hopes and fears about decentralization? I think there's a very present danger that decentralized technology could give rise to things that are even more centralized in the future. And I think one of the things that's incumbent upon people who work in the space is how do we guard against that and make sure we get to a better place that isn't like, solve some kind of a low-level need that people have, but more broadly, it's just like even less accountable at the end of the day. It's even less there's even less ability to ask for real change.
And with that, we have covered some of the questions in the chat, and we are at the top of the hour and at the end of our 45-minute time slot. And Simon, I think that's a great place to leave this conversation, that it's about what the technology enables and achieves, and also understanding the risks that can happen in any system, including a decentralized one, and making sure that those are guarded against. So thank you very much to our panelists for joining us, as well as those who joined us for this. Hopefully you have found this informative and interesting, and please do come back for more as the day progresses here at Ethereal, and come again to our future events. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.